Happy New Year to our friendly alumni. Welcome to From Here Forward, the informative, funny UBC Podcast Network podcast. We're your girls, Carol and Jeevan.
And once again, Happy New Year.
I just love that you copied me, but I respect it. Happy New Year to you, to me, to us all. I hope you all made some fire New Year's resolutions, because I didn't. Not to be a hater, but I just New Year's resolutions I think are overrated.
Really?
Because you're setting yourself up for failure is my take. I respect it. I support it. But I am constantly fighting for my life. I'm going to be really good and journal. No. Day 2, I'm bored. I'm going to try to work. No, she's dead. Nothing ever works for me.
So cynical. But I get it. I think when you're too rigid with your New Year's resolutions, it can feel really restrictive. And then you're just end of January has come around and I haven't achieved any of it. But I think for me, it's nice to have things that we want to improve on or things that we want to implement into our lives without having it be the weight of a resolution. And, in thinking about people who have done a lot with their lives, flawless transition. Today, we chatted with Bill Nikolai, a UBC alumni who is a multi-hyphenate in almost every single sense of the word. In addition to working as an academic librarian for many years, Bill is also an actor, a teacher, and get this, a recreational paraglider.
He can do it all. And as we start a new year, some people might be thinking about new opportunities for adventure, for growth, for improvement. I surely am not, but, who better to learn from than Bill?
Totally. Bill was a great person to chat with. So without further ado, let's glide into the interview.
Okay. So, Bill, why don't you give us a little intro into who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm a retiree. I'm a Q-tip guy with gray and white hair, but I have lots of passions, and a lot of them have to do with adventure of one sort or another. Quick background, I retired as a librarian. Prior to that, I'd done a bunch of things, including working in Japan as an English instructor at various universities. Worked on a TV show for 5 years as a stand-in, photo double, had a small role in the show. There's a whole variety of stuff that I've done in the past. So yeah, my life is actually a never-ending adventure.
We are an alumni UBC podcast. So maybe to start, can you take us back to your years at UBC? What were they like and how did they shape your forthcoming interests?
Yeah, so it all started in 1975, which is, I know, ancient history for most people listening to this. But I did a BA in international relations, which was a multidisciplinary subject area. I think it still is. You can draw from history, psychology, philosophy, all kinds of different courses. And I think it's because I do have a eclectic interests, like a wide range of interests, that I followed up with a teaching certificate. So I am still actually in the BC teacher registry. Never really did much teaching at the public school level, which is what I was trained to do during that 1 year. Did a lot of research instruction when I worked as a librarian. So subsequently, after the teaching certificate, did an ESL diploma, did a master's in education, ended up in Japan for some time, and then came back after my second stint in Japan and did a second master's degree at UBC. And this one happened to be in library and information studies. And that's what took me into the library world. I worked as an academic librarian at Vancouver Community College before retiring, just before COVID, which was the perfect time to retire. So yeah, all of my academic background was at UBC, and it very much shaped a lot of what I was doing. Even the little stint in television, it's an ongoing stint. I'm still working occasionally in the business. I took film courses at UBC. I almost would have done what would be considered a second major in film and television. Took acting classes, appeared in one main stage production at the Freddie Wood. So yeah, a lot of what I did at UBC informed who I am and where I've traveled in life.
That's a lot of stuff, Bill.
I just used up most of the podcast, I think.
No, that's very cool. Before we get into your library and your acting stuff, you're in the world of paragliding, which is crazy.
Yeah, so paragliding, for those of you who are not really familiar with it, it's basically foot-launched free flight, where we're using a wing that's collapsible, very much like a parachute canopy, right? So the first time I actually saw it live and in person was while doing a hike in the Fraser Valley, a mountain called Mount Chiam. It's probably the highest mountain in the Fraser Valley. It's a beautiful peak. Got up there and found a gentleman who was unfurling or unpacking a very large backpack. He proceeded to hitch himself into a harness along with his passenger, who I learned later was his wife, and they flew off the mountain. down into the valley. And I thought that is the way to go. You put in the sweat equity to get up the mountain, and then you take the easy way down, right? So that was my first encounter. That's how I got really interested in it. The following year, I did what I like to call a crash course. And it was a 3-day course where I kind of got introduced to it firsthand, hands on. Did 5 solo flights during that first weekend, and then follow that up with a 2-week intensive novice course the following year in the Okanagan, where I actually got a rating. We are kind of a self-regulated sport, and I got my novice rating a year later over that 2-week period. So that's how I got into it back a quarter of a century ago now, and I'm still doing it. So it hasn't killed me yet.
How would you describe being up there that keeps you wanting to, maximize your time in the air?
Oh wow, there's so many things going on. I mean, part of it is the view. I mean, you're flying and experiencing a perspective that really only birds get to experience. And even if you're in a motorized aircraft, you're not getting the same sense of flight, because when you're flying a paraglider, you're flying basically low and slow. By that, I mean, you can fly very close to the terrain. You can see stuff like deer running through the woods. I've had hawks and eagles, curious birds circling in a thermal with me. Perspective is absolutely amazing. And it's, I think, similar to scuba diving in some ways. You're in an alien environment, and you're seeing stuff that you normally wouldn't see unless you're watching something on television or you're in IMAX theater or something like that. But it's just a really different experience to be in there yourself, and it really puts you in the moment. I think that's something that I have to say about adventure in general, is that you kind of forget about or put aside anything else that may be bothering you, worrying you, whatever it might be, and you're very, very focused. And that's something that's, I think, amazing about experiencing adventures, is being in the moment, being in the present, and really being focused on something. There are lots of other things I could tell you about flying, but there's the just the idea of being able to deal with a certain amount of risk. Anytime you're more than 10 or 12 feet off the ground, you're experiencing a risk, and that risk is coming into violent contact with the ground. So, whether you're climbing a ladder or you're hiking a steep slope or you're paragliding, you're dealing with the risk, and you're trying to mitigate that risk, and you're trying to manage that risk. And if you're successful, which hopefully you are more than just say 99% of the time, then you experience a certain amount of self-confidence, I think, and success in being able to handle that risk. And so often we just never put ourselves in those situations where we can deal with that. So I think that's something that's be said for any kind of adventurous endeavor.
My hands are sweating. You're talking about heights, and I'm so scared of heights. Things are moist. A lot of things have changed over the last few years, climate change, whatever, etc. Have you noticed, this looks different from maybe a few months ago or years ago? Anything that's stuck out to you?
Yeah, maybe not so much in paragliding, but something, well, maybe a little more mundane. Well, mundane is not the right word. Hiking. Yesterday I was looking through some old photographs that go back to the early 80s. And we were hiking locally, and I'm thinking specifically of a place called Wedgemount Lake. And it's a fairly rigorous hike. It's just north of Whistler. You're gaining about 5,000 feet of elevation over the course of 2.5 hours or so. And at the end of it is a glacier. And that glacier, in the photographs I was looking at yesterday, that glacier was calving directly into the lake. In other words, the glacier was probably about 25 feet in thickness at the lake's edge. And now, I mean, I haven't been up to Wedgemount for a few years, but my understanding is that glacier has receded tremendously. It's back probably a couple of 100 meters at least. I could be wrong, but I think it's in that neighborhood. So yeah, definitely when doing things in nature locally, there's definitely evidence that change is happening. Paragliding, maybe not so much, because I'm not a cross-country pilot. I should explain that in paragliding, some people like to go vast distances. I'm talking like 100 or 200 kilometers in a single flight. So if you do that on a regular basis, I'm sure that you're going to see some geographical changes that, we can assume are largely due to the weather. So yeah, perspective is everything.
Speaking of perspective, perfect transition. Big question coming up. What lessons do you think paragliding has taught you that you've been able to apply in other parts of your life? I know you mentioned being in the present, but is there anything else in terms of that entire process, or perhaps the certain level of risk that comes with it, that you've been able to apply into other aspects of your life and your growth as an individual?
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody who does any kind of aviation would probably agree that you really need to be aware of and you need to mitigate risk. And when it comes to paragliding, often weather is a big risk, or it can be. And so, because you're essentially flying a very slow aircraft, top speed is only maybe 50 kilometers an hour in the air mass, you're subject to some serious problems if the weather takes a sudden turn for the worse. I mean, more so than a powered aircraft, because you can power through violent updrafts, especially if you're, say, an airline pilot. You've got a very big aircraft flying at very great speeds, and you can basically just fly above a lot of that stuff, or just go through it very quickly. So yeah, so every time I fly, I'm looking at the weather. I've had a few instances over the 25 years that I've been flying that have made me think about my decisions. I mean, I can think of one in Okinawa where I was about to do some soaring on the seaside. And it was going to be very low altitude soaring, just back and forth along a beach. And I should have known better, but looking offshore in the distance, I could see some dark clouds. And of course, when dark clouds dump rain, they push air ahead of them. And so in this case, that offshore cloud dumping rain pushed essentially what we call a gust front towards the shore. And I was pretty much yanked off of my launch. And then I just remember the man who was leading the local Japanese flying club yelling at me, "Fly the glider, fly the glider." And I tried to fly the glider, and I flew it right into the mangrove forest that was right behind launch. So there's no damage done, not to myself, not to the glider. But it did take about a half an hour for people to come and help extricate me from the mess that I found myself in. Mangrove forests are very tangled. And more recently, a couple of years ago, I had an incident. By that, I mean about, I'd say, a third of my glider collapsed and put me into a fairly tight spiral dive. And it was probably due to wind shear. Air mass is kind of moving in opposite directions. And it took a lot of quick thinking and some luck that got me out of that situation. But I was only 200 meters off of the surface in North Vancouver, over a bunch of houses. And in 10 seconds, I lost half of my altitude. So I was moving down at over 30 kilometers an hour for about 10 seconds. And, a lot of things went through my mind at that moment. I managed to put in the correct inputs to stabilize the glider and get myself out of that situation. But I still had a bunch of decisions to make, as I was no longer able to go to my usual landing area. I had to kind of thread the needle between a couple of trees and skid out a landing on a lawn. I had a little bit of PTSD after that for for about a week. So I would say that's certainly something that paragliding has kind of taught me, is to try to prepare and mitigate the risk. And it's probably a good life lesson for anybody, whether you're in business or you're studying for an exam at UBC. I recall a history test it was History 432, as a matter of fact, history of the great powers in the 20th century. And I studied 2 solid weeks for the final exam. And what I was trying to do was figure out what was the minimum number of questions that could possibly be posed on the test, that I could answer. And so it took me 2 weeks. I mean, I figured out that if I studied this question, that question, and I think it was about 7 other ones, I would be sure to be able to answer at least 3 of the questions that would appear on the test. So yeah, preparation. It was all about preparation and mitigating the risk that I would encounter something that was unexpected. And yeah, so it's not a bad life lesson.
Who would have thought there'd be a tie between History 432 and paragliding?
Yeah.
Every UBC student has the one test they remember in detail.
Oh yeah, that's definitely one test that I remember. I mean, and I was lucky, and it all worked out.
And another question for when you're up there, and this might sound silly to you, but like no music, nothing. Like you're just up there, like fully present in the moment. That's
Well, I do have friends who fly with music. One friend, Rod, if you're listening to this, I do appreciate your music on launch sometimes. Other times I'm trying to focus what I'm doing. But no, I mean, I have early on, when I was living in Okinawa, I did fly with some music, but I just found it wasn't for me. I mean, in Okinawa, I was often flying solo, but locally here, we all use 2-meter band shortwave radios. And so we want to be able to communicate with each other. And so I tend to avoid music.
So you've worn many hats over the years, from librarianship, academia, acting, and paragliding. I'm curious how you see those interests connecting with each other, if at all.
Oh, wow. They are. I mean, I guess the outlier would be probably the librarianship. Getting back to academia and UBC, et cetera, I've always been interested in information and organizing it, sharing it, helping people find it. And so it was almost a logical kind of graduate degree to do. Librarianship seemed to be a good way to kind of ladder up and leverage the previous academic background. And I honestly, I found it a fascinating area to be in. I mean, everybody has these stereotypical ideas of librarians, the shh and the bun and, but it's really not like that. It's all about helping people find and organize information, which I think is more important now than it ever has been in this age of misinformation and fake news. So what ties it all together? So I mentioned that the library part of it is kind of the outlier, but the rest of it really is kind of tied together by adventure, I think, in some ways. Linda and I moved to Japan almost on a whim. I had an opportunity to substitute for the brother of a friend who was going to finish his PhD. So I had the credentials to teach English at a university in Japan, but this job just kind of happened along, and we had no idea, what the living circumstances would be, or even what the salary would be. We just decided to take a leap and go there, and it worked out really well. And that's kind of been the trajectory throughout my life. I mean, if an opportunity presents itself, then go for it. The film and TV stuff, the bulk of that was 5 years on a sci-fi show called Stargate SG-1. And that was an adventure. Every day was new. We were doing something different. And, one thing led to another. I was photo doubling one of the actors. I'll never forget one day where I was asked to photo double the actor, and it involved holding a gun and then falling to the ground, which doesn't sound like a big deal. It's not really considered a stunt, but I had broken a couple of ribs just prior to that, doing, ironically, pull-ups in my underground parking at the condo. And just to fall on the ground holding this big ass gun was actually really tough. Like, it hurt like hell. But anyways, yeah, there's always some adventure. I subsequently got a small role on a TV movie called First Target. And in that one, I was actually asked to do a stunt. And the stunt involved getting kicked by a very beautiful woman and knocked into the water and then drowned. And so, yeah, there's adventure in all of that, right? I mean, there's the danger of actually really getting kicked. The English teaching was travel, so that's adventure. And sometimes it does turn into misadventure. You're not expecting it to be super adventurous, but it can happen. I recently published a story in the Vancouver Sun about a trip to France, where my wife and I lost 2 iPhones and a wallet, all during the same trip. So it was a trip where we were doing some bicycling, we're doing a bunch of other stuff. But the story on that trip for me, at least as far as what I was putting into print, was the misadventure of getting pickpocketed 3 times, actually, on the same trip.
That's hilarious and crazy. And I can't even imagine. I think actually this ties in really well with the next question, which I think I'm so inspired and impressed by this like constant hunger for adventure that it seems that you have. Like, it's this like long sort of desire to experience new things or the same things in different ways. And so I'm wondering what you might have to say to people who, maybe they're not seeking adventure in the conventional sense. Maybe they don't want to go paragliding, but people who are feeling like they're in a rut and maybe want to spice things up and want to find new things to experience in their life. How do you build that into your life? Where do you start?
Oh, wow. I think there's a few things that you can do. One is figure out, what are your fears? Like, what are you afraid of? What are you really afraid of? You might want to avoid some of that, but there are things that you maybe mildly fear that you're kind of interested in. It could be public speaking. It's something that a lot of people are very afraid of. It could be a lot of different things. So figure out what it is that you are somewhat afraid of, but you would like to try, and then give it a shot. Challenge yourself, and also figure out what your benchmarks are. Like, if you know you can do A, think about possibly stepping it up to do B, and just see if it's possible. I've I like to cycle. For a while, I was toying with this idea of trying to ride Vancouver to Seattle in a day. And I guess I was 56 at the time, and I decided to give it a shot. I mean, I started at 4 in the morning, I believe, out of Vancouver, and ended up in the train station in Seattle at 6 p.m. And then I jumped on the Amtrak and headed back to Vancouver an hour later. But it was a challenge that I'd set for myself, and a lot of things had to come together. The weather had to be just right for it to happen, but it was super fun. And yeah, set yourself little challenges, figure out what you're capable of, and try to aspire to doing something more. And there's lots of rewards to be had with that. Even travel. I mean, one thing about travel that I find, and I've talked to other people who find the same thing, is that you find that by breaking out of the routine and experiencing something new just about every minute of every day when you're traveling, you slow down time. And there's some evidence for that. So maybe this aspiration to travel, experience adventure is just a way for me to deny mortality and try to live forever, because I'll be on a trip and my wife will agree with me. We might be gone for a week and it's felt like a month. I mean, it's just because there's so many new things coming at you every day. And it doesn't all have to be crazy risky, but yeah, there's new stuff all the time. Got bitten by a dog once in Phuket, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but it broke the skin. And I happened to be right by a public washroom with soap and water. I washed it all out. But then I started doing some internet medical advising, and I discovered that 10% of the dogs, at least in Bangkok, are rabid, and that if you contract rabies, you're basically toast. And so that little morning adventure of going for a run turned into a little bit of a misadventure, in that I ended up at a clinic getting a rabies shot, and then packing syringes of rabies vaccine with me for the rest of the trip, throughout Thailand and into Laos. So yeah, so lots of things can happen when you decide to break out of your routine, whether it be through travel or something else. But, in thinking about adventure the last day or two, because I knew I was going to be on this podcast, I was thinking that it really does change as time goes on. You may find yourself reevaluating what you're comfortable in doing as you get older, or as your circumstances change. So just to divulge a little bit of personal medical information here, a year ago I had a massive blood clot. So that's all gone pretty well, but I am on anticoagulants, on blood thinners. And so I'm kind of currently reassessing my willingness to do things that put me at risk of bleeding. So, that's potentially going to change some of the things that I do. So it's a constantly evolving thing, dealing with risk in your quest to seek adventure. It's funny. I was at the gym this morning, and next to me was a woman who I'm guessing was late 70s, maybe early 80s. And she was just telling me about this 112-day cruise that she did. And there were 47 ports of call, 2,000 passengers, 20 people died on that cruise through various circumstances. So, I don't think of cruises generally as being super adventurous, but I was quite impressed with that statistic. She, mentioned that one woman who I think was in the cabin next to hers lost a husband on the cruise, and at the next port of call, he was cremated, and then he was brought back on board, and she finished the cruise. And I thought, wow, that's an amazing story. I mean, yeah. So your sense of adventure can dictate what you do, but it also can change over time. It can change depending on the circumstances. Yeah. So you wouldn't be, Carol, you wouldn't be the person who would put a tarantula in her hand on the tarantula farm in Costa Rica.
This probably isn't the best time to tell you that we're going skydiving for our next episode. So
I've never skydived. I think it's just far too dangerous.
Interesting.
I'm joking. Skydiving doesn't scare me, but I've chosen never to do it just because it's such a short experience. Like, I'd rather be in the air, for a half hour, an hour, 2 hours, whatever, right? So I have to tell you, some of these guys who do the cross-country paragliding, they're into hardcore adventure, and they'll be in the air for 6 or 7 hours. And so peeing is an issue, and so some of these guys will fly with condom catheters. So they'll run a tube down their pant leg, and they'll be able to just pee into the atmosphere when they need to.
So a lot of young people, myself included, we struggle with who we are in terms of, our different interests outside of our careers, or even the whole dilemma of like, who am I after I switch careers? So I'm just curious how you label yourself as someone who has a lot of outside of just being a paraglider.
I once heard someone refer to me as a poser, but I've thought about it ever since. I don't really like that term, but I don't know. I mean, I think anything I've ever done, I've always done with an eye to what could it possibly lead to, while at the same time really enjoying the moment. I never held a job for more than 5 years until I started my library job, which was in 2008. So I went back to UBC to do my MLIS degree in 2006. And at the time I was 50, one of the older students in the class. I did graduate with the highest GPA in the class, though. I have to throw that in there. But how do I describe myself? If anything, a vagabond of sorts. I mean, it's good to be an expert, but there's something to be said for being a jack of all trades and being interested in everything and knowing a little bit about a lot of things. And having said that, I wouldn't claim to be an expert in any one thing. It drives me nuts when I hear people talk about something that they really know nothing about and do things like vote based on misinformation and information that, something that they think they know a lot about, but in fact they know very little about, whether it be economics or whatever, foreign policy. So yeah, I think it's good to know a little about a lot of things, but unless you really are an expert, don't claim to be one.
Absolutely. It's so fun chatting with you and hearing about your life and your interests.
Well, thank you both for having me on. I was a little nervous about it. There's a certain amount of risk in coming on to any kind of podcast, but you guys have certainly made me feel comfortable.
Thank you so much for this conversation.
I know I say this about like 90% of adults that I meet, but I would like to be Bill when I grow up.
You are grown up, but I get what you're saying. I took so much away from our conversation with Bill today. I mean, thinking a lot about risk management. I've been thinking a lot in the new year about getting out of my comfort zone a little bit, in measured ways, trying to figure out ways to challenge myself so that I'm #growing or whatever. But also I was thinking a lot about just how much Bill does and how much Bill is passionate about. And I've always really related to this idea of like being a jack of all trades, in the sense that I'm interested in a lot of different things and I don't always know how to implement them into my life. And I think his conversation was like a really nice reminder. You can kind of just like invest time in the things that you enjoy doing. There's like endless possibilities and the different kinds of things you can implement into your life. What did you think, Carol?
I mean, it was really refreshing hearing from someone of Bill's generation talking about the fact that like you can do a bunch of different things and not pigeonhole yourself into a particular career or identity. And it does kind of remind me to not generalize a whole older group of people. But it was also weird because as he was speaking about being a jack of all trades and no expert, I could feel in my body discomfort because I have incredible imposter syndrome, and not being an expert in one and not identifying myself as one thing makes me spiral because I'm like, well, then what am I? So I was really grappling with what he was saying, but I did appreciate that he has this love for life, which I feel like for a lot of burnt out people, we're like, every day's a new day and I hate it. But he was like, let's seize the moment. And I would like to get there at some point, but right now I'm just like, seizing means I am getting out of bed and having a cup of coffee.
I think there's a lot of pressure to find like one way to fit into the world or one way to like categorize yourself.
Yeah, it's just, I don't even know. I'm a girl trying to figure it out. Who's broke?
I identify as a member of the human race.
I like that. What a great way to end this beautiful conversation. Anyway, thank you for listening. Make sure you catch our next episode by subscribing or following our show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're feeling your feels, please drop us a review. You can find me on Blue Sky at Carol Eugene Park.
And me at Jeevan K. Sangha on X, formerly Twitter. From Here Forward is an alumni UBC podcast produced by Podium Podcast Company.